During the late Middle Ages, the Black Death devastated the entire Old World. Here, we will focus on the Black Death and its impact on Europe. Although major epidemics occurred on a semi-regular basis until 1500, we will focus primarily on the first, largest, and most impactful outbreak, which occurred between 1347 and 1353 CE. Over the course of this lecture, we will discuss the bubonic plague and how it spread, the response from the medical practitioners of the time, new estimates of the disease's death toll, how it challenged family cohesion, religious responses to the Black Death, the scapegoating of marginalized people, and the economic impact of the Black Death on economic life. The disease that the medieval Europeans termed the Black Death is what we know as bubonic plague. Bubonic plague is caused by the bacteria Yersinia pestis, which is a bacteria spread primarily by fleas which travel on rats. The rats which are most likely to transmit this disease are black rats and brown rats. Medieval Europeans readily identified that there was a strong link between black rats and the plague, to the point that black rats became known as plague rats. We also know that it's possible for this bacteria to be spread by human body lice. In this period, most people did not have access to regular bathing, and as such, almost everyone had body lice. So, that, of course, makes outbreaks much worse. We also see that, typically speaking, the worst outbreaks were accompanied by unsanitary conditions in the presence of large numbers of rats. At a certain point, Europeans began to fear an oncoming plague outbreak when they would see more rats than normal. We also know, however, that once one person gets it, they can transmit it to others, and that's something that, as we'll see, medieval Europeans were aware of. The disease bubonic plague gets its name from the way that it causes glands to swell into what the Greeks referred to as buboes, a rounded, swollen gland that was often discolored. If the disease was untreated, there was anywhere between a 40 to 90% chance of death. And the reason why this number varies so much is something that we'll get into as we go along, but suffice it to say for now that there are a number of factors which impact how one can cope with bubonic plague. And by the way, the term Black Death comes from the fact that one's fingers, especially the fingertips and toes, become black with this disease. So it's not just the buboes that form, there is also the heavy discoloration of the fingers and toes. There are two subvarieties of bubonic plague I will mention briefly, and those are pneumonic, where the plague settles into one's lungs, and septicemic, where the plague settles into one's blood. And if either of those forms of the plague happens to infect someone, then they are effectively doomed. As we saw, a number of people did recover from the normal bubonic plague, but pneumonic and septicemic plague are more or less 100% fatal, and that is even true today. This deadly bacterial plague had broken out in the past, but never to this extent. The most notable early outbreak occurred some 800 years before the Great Outbreak, and that was under the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I, and it very much disrupted his plans to restore the West to Roman control. So this plague raged for about 3 years, from 541 to 544, and disproportionately harmed the Byzantines. There were then a dozen more regional outbreaks until about 750, and then the plague kind of retreated for quite a while, and then it came back with a vengeance in 1347. Medieval doctors tried their best to deal with the plague, but they simply did not have the understanding of disease needed to truly explain what it was. Traditional medical explanations, most of which dated back to the time of the Greek Dr. Hippocrates, were not adequate to explain what doctors were experiencing in 1347. An imbalance of the humor certainly could not account for people over a broad geographic area becoming deathly ill and dying in droves. Also, the idea of miasma, or a contaminated environment, couldn't possibly apply to this much territory at once. Ultimately, the only thing that doctors could come up with that made any sense at all was that there was some kind of natural poison that was being spread around through the air and that it was causing people to become ill. They had no real understanding of germs or of bacteria, so they figured it must be some kind of naturally occurring poison, which I suppose is kind of an application of the theory of miasma, but a little bit more evolved because of this new circumstance. And it's worth noting, for now, we'll come back to this later, that doctors did not distinguish strictly between natural and artificial poison, because again, one could go out in the wilderness and pick plants that were poisonous and use those to create poisons that people could use against one another. And this would lead to some speculating that not all of these outbreaks were accidental. One thing doctors did agree upon is that the disease was highly contagious, and as such, as we'll see, they recommended quarantine. In the Islamic world, a similar process took shape, and by the way, most of the fundamental precepts of Islamic medicine were also derived from the Greeks and Romans, since the Islamic world had imported many of the Greek scientific texts and translated them into Arabic. However, they denied the idea of contagion, not because they didn't believe it. They certainly knew that the disease was contagious, but doctors agreed to tell people it was not because they were afraid that this would undermine the idea of Allah as the cause of all things and also scare people out of performing their social duties. I note this here because later on we'll see that the European world did have this latter problem. Doctors recommended quarantining the ill and keeping away from others as much as possible. But in practice, this was a very difficult thing to do since most people lived in cramped quarters with large families, and only if you were well off or some kind of a hermit was it really practicable to, I guess you could call it, social distance. Treatment for it to have any effect whatsoever and to give a person a better chance of survival needed to start within a day or two of the first symptoms, and typically was only treating the outer symptoms. This consisted of lancing or otherwise deflating buboes as they emerged, and administering food to the sick so that they would be able to keep up their strength. These treatments did help a little bit, but there was a bit of a chance of causing infection if you were to use unsanitized blades in order to lance the buboes, which of course is exactly what happened. There was no, they didn't have the tools needed to sanitize their instruments, so this was not an uncommon way for people to get ill and die. So it was still better than nothing, but we have to remember that this was a medical crisis that the medical establishment of the day was simply not equipped to deal with on any level. And if we think about the mortality rate of the disease, we also have to remember that doctors are dropping dead left, right, and center. For reasons that are abundantly obvious, the Black Death has been a topic of research and discussion for centuries. However, it was only in the middle of the 20th century when historians decided to try to really quantify the impact of the Black Death and to try to establish an approximate death toll. The first historians who tried to answer this question looked at the first documents they could find, and they relied upon medieval testimony that the Black Death killed indiscriminately from the young and old, men and women, etc. And the first documents that they found, which gave them some idea of the body count, were the English crown records of the king's tenants-in-chief. This group of men, about 3,200 total in the entirety of England, represented the creme de la creme of society. And for them, it would appear that the death rate was somewhere in the neighborhood of 27%. And so, historians of the mid-20th century said that the death rate was around 1/3, give or take. That's not a bad starting point. However, we now know that this number is quite a bit off. And the reason that we know that is because we now have a little bit better understanding of how the disease actually spread. And also, we have looked at a lot of physical evidence and compared what we found in England to what we found in other parts of Europe. Looking at more recent document findings, including more local records that include people of more humble backgrounds, and physical remains, including mass graves from the period, we now think that the overall mortality rate was around 50 to 60% during the major outbreak from 1347 to 1353. And the difference, as we'll see, came largely due to class. As I mentioned earlier, quarantining was most practiced by people who were most able to practice it, i.e. the elite. We also have to keep in mind nutrition. The more wealthy you were, the more likely you were to have a healthy diet. And of course, your diet affects your ability to fight off disease. We also at one point thought that Europe's population, after declining by a third, began to recover immediately after 1353, with only some minor bumps during the subsequent outbreaks that occurred until 1500. But we now know, based on land tenancy and other indicators, that these subsequent outbreaks, even though they were localized, were still severe enough to prevent a general population recovery from starting until about 1450. There's an old saying that blood is thicker than water, and what that means is that people typically value kinship over any other consideration. People are usually willing to stand beside their loved ones, fight, and die for them. However, during the Black Death, fear arguably proved to be a little bit thicker than blood, at least for some people. And this fear of death effectively caused a breakdown of cherished social norms. Now, it's worth noting that we don't have any real way to estimate how many people chose to abandon their loved ones rather than staying by their side. We can tell from the mortality rate that many people did stay by the sides of their loved ones and paid the ultimate penalty for doing so. But it was not uncommon for parents and children to abandon one another, for spouses to abandon one another, rather than care for each other once buboes started to appear, because they knew that the disease was both highly contagious and extremely deadly. There were also stories of entire households perishing due to this disease. There are some stories of men especially who would run off into the woods and try to live away from everyone else until the disease had passed, until that particular outbreak was over, and they would try to live off the land. This was such a widespread and widely known phenomenon that it quickly became one of the leading moral issues for theologians to debate. And interestingly enough, the consensus by about 1500 or so, by most of the major thinkers, but not all, is that taking flight was a natural part of human nature given the extremity of the danger, and so it is a person's right and not something to be condemned, despite the fact that it is an antisocial behavior. This, of course, stands in stark contrast to what we talked about earlier, where in the Islamic world, doctors did not tell people that the disease was contagious because they were afraid of something like this occurring. I would like to circle back to the idea of preventing the spread of plague by avoiding contact with other people. Today we call this practice social distancing. Even today, for blue-collar workers, social distancing proved to be not terribly practical. If you're a white-collar worker, you can work from home. If you work with your hands for a living, not so much. In the Middle Ages, it will not shock you to learn, the vast majority of the population would fall under the blue-collar heading. Most people were farmers, and the people who lived in towns especially were in cramped conditions where there was nowhere to go. So for most people in the Middle Ages, social distancing was something that they didn't really have the option of attempting, much less pulling off. The elite could and did keep their distance from others, but of course their practice of keeping their distance was never entirely perfect. Remember earlier I talked about how we know that among the king's chief nobles, the rate of death was somewhere in the vicinity of 27%. Well, if you look at crowded areas, especially the poor sections of cities and towns, it looks like the mortality rate in some places got up to 80%. So this is an instance where class status was very much the biggest predictor of one's survival. The more money one had, the more likely one was to survive the Black Death. 27% and 80% are astronomically different odds of survival, although neither is exactly what we would call encouraging. Another advantage the elite had was better nutrition. And not to mention, if you are a wealthy person who starts showing signs, you're much more likely to find a doctor or at least someone willing to play one and keep you fed and risk dying on your behalf than if you are, say, a semi-socially isolated person on the margins of society. So, the biggest variable of all was not age, it wasn't gender, it was class. The poorer you were, the more likely you were to die. The wealthier you were, the more likely you were to survive. The Black Death was every bit as much a shock to the psyches of people living at the time as it was to their bodies. People panicked, and people also wanted answers. Just as doctors looked to the traditions of medicine, so too did people look to their traditional religions to try to find answers, both in terms of why this was happening and looking for ways that they could get the divine to intervene and stop this. The most well-known group from the first great outbreak of bubonic plague starting in 1347 were a group called the Flagellants, or as they are sometimes known, the Red Knights of Christ. Traditionally, the history of the Flagellants was written by the Catholic Church, which took a very hostile view of them because the Flagellants were largely a peasant movement composed of people who were not directly answerable to the church hierarchy. And so they portrayed the Flagellants as fanatics and people who were lawless mobs. However, in more recent years, historians have located documents kept by the Flagellants themselves, and we now know that it was much more complex than the way that the church portrayed it. We know, for instance, that the Flagellants were not promoters of heresy. Their views were fairly in line with what the church taught every Sunday. They just took things a bit further, and they took things into their own hands. They didn't wait on their bishops and priests to give them instructions. They simply went out and did what they thought would help. The Flagellants were also not all that destructive, so far as we can tell, and in fact, rather than tearing towns apart when they would arrive, they were instead greeted. They would send messengers ahead, towns knew they were coming, and they would provide them with food, beer, and accommodations. When Flagellants would arrive, they would march through town, singing hymns, and when they would get to the town square, it was only there that a few of their members would strip down and engage in whipping after confessing to some of their particular sins. And unlike the way it's portrayed sometimes, there was no whipping while people walked, and they also would not whip themselves to the point of inflicting severe injuries upon themselves or of killing themselves. So, while the whipping was the sort of most notable and unique thing about the Flagellants, most of what they did was march around and try to sing hymns and then get people to confess their sins. So this was not all that different, again, than what the church was teaching. The movement mostly seems to have been more popular with women than men. There are accounts of men wanting to shut the gates against the Flagellants where their wives are urging them to let them in. And it also had a lot more following among peasants and people of humble backgrounds than it did with the church and with the more noble lay class. So the papacy was none too pleased with a movement that did not take its instructions directly from elite members of the church, and so the Pope in 1349 issued an edict against the flagellants, and the movement was suppressed within months. Afterwards, of course, the church wrote that the flagellants had been bad guys, and the movement fizzled out pretty quickly after the church condemned it. While we're on the topic of religion and people looking for actions that they could take which might alleviate their suffering in the present, let us consider how some Christians in this era looked for people to blame. If we circle back, we will recall that the most common explanation by doctors in the Middle Ages was that there was a poison that was being spread through the air, a naturally occurring poison. Well, because of how horrific the suffering of people was, there were some Christians who thought that this poison must not be an accident, that it was an artificial disaster, and that the perpetrators were their neighbors, the Jews. It is very common in medieval history for the Christian majority to accuse the Jewish minority of any number of outrages or crimes. People knew, or at least suspected, that it was possible to sicken large populations by poisoning wells and springs, and so there were Christians who spread the idea that Jews were doing exactly that, and that this was the root cause of the spread of the contagion. At one point, and in this period, for the most part, you could get away with torture as a means of extracting a confession. There was a forced confession in the city of Châtel, where a local Jew confessed to poisoning the well somewhere, and after the news of that particular revelation came out, the hysteria spread like wildfire throughout a broad region in Switzerland, southwest Germany, and parts of eastern France. There were Jews being tried and murdered in at least 340 cities and possibly as many as 400 in 1348 and 1349 at the height of the hysteria. These accusations were not just against Jews, however. They also extended to Jewish people who had converted to Christianity and who were seen as perhaps agents of Judaism in disguise. And this also extended to more marginalized Christians, people who were social outcasts or people who were simply disliked and for whatever reason. The idea, according to the accusers, is that the Jews wanted to murder all of the Christians, and therefore they had started this horrible disease. Exactly how widespread this belief was is very hard to say, but we have to remember that people were in an agitated state, and a lot of people who participated in this process would not have been people who would have been swept up to do such a thing under normal circumstances. To underline this point, think about the body count that we're about to look at. So during the First Crusade, there were the people who signed up for the initial crusading army were overzealous about religion, and sometimes they would go along the Rhine and round up local Jews and murder them. Well, the fact that they were never able to get a huge body count while doing so indicates that most of the people along the Rhine were not cooperating in rounding up the Jews for them. But at Strasbourg, which is on the French side of the Rhine, on February 14th, 1349, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in a single day, and that exceeded the entire body count of the Rhineland massacres of 1096. So the hysteria here was far greater than what had occurred in 1096 over a period of months. And this is just one day in a single city, and that's probably the worst day of this entire episode, but still, it does give you some perspective on just how terrified people were and the extreme measures they were willing to go to try to find solutions to this problem. And it also shows that people were turning to not only traditional methods of understanding the world, but traditional scapegoats and traditional solutions to try to deal with this problem. Needless to say, neither the flagellants nor the people trying to burn Jewish people alive in order to try to end the plague were successful, and that's probably a large part of the reason why these kinds of persecutions stopped after 1349, once it became apparent that this wasn't going to do the trick. And now for the final question of this lecture, and not the least thorny. What was the economic impact of the Black Death? First of all, I have to note that whenever we talk about the economy in the distant past, we need to remember something very crucial. Our concept of the economy as the sum total of all economic activity only truly applies to the period from about the late 1940s to the present. Before that time, there was no idea of a sum total economy as such. So, because of that, we don't have detailed economic data from the past. People at the time did not think of the world in the same way that we do. So, we're largely guessing based on circumstantial evidence about the economic impact of the Black Death. Looking at the laws of supply and demand, which of course are understood a little differently by us than they would be by medieval Europeans, it is safe to say that with so many people dead, there was less demand for goods and then more demand for labor. So in general, this should be a good environment for workers. They will be able to demand higher wages for their labor, and the price of goods will go down dramatically because of the lack of demand. And for the most part, it does appear that this happened, both that goods are more readily available and that workers benefited through higher wages. However, this was not lost on the ruling class, and it should come as no surprise to you that they quickly took measures all across Europe to try to offset the economic gains of the common man by reinforcing feudal arrangements, i.e. obligations to lords, by placing caps on wages in order to prevent people from making too much money, and even sumptuary laws where they made it illegal for common people to buy certain goods. So for instance, now that people had more money, they wanted to buy fancier clothes. And in some places that was outlawed. Although it's worth noting that most of these laws do not seem to have been super effective. And we also have to remember that not only were these laws enforced pretty unevenly, we know of many instances where people were getting paid more than what they were allowed to be paid, but we also know that there is considerable regional variance. Much of the picture that we have traditionally had for this impact where workers benefited massively after the Black Death comes to us from England, where this happened in the most clear fashion. But over time, we have compared what happened in England and Italy with what happened in the rest of Europe. And in fact, what we see is that the impact of the Black Death was different depending on where you were. For the most part, the Black Death did serve to undermine serfdom in Western Europe, especially in Britain, but also in France. In Italy, serfdom had never quite been a thing, so it wasn't quite as impactful. In Spain, it did challenge the power structure, but the power structure clamped down much harder than it did in England and France. Germany, what was the Holy Roman Empire, had a similar experience to what happened in France. If you go east of that point, however, in Eastern Europe, actually the Black Death set the stage for the rise of feudalism for the first time. So, depending on where you were, the impact was different. And it also took a while for this to happen. This was not an overnight revolution. This was a long evolution. And so, the Black Death in many ways, by increasing individual prosperity and freedom in Western Europe, helped the Renaissance to grow and spread. Not only did common people make more money and have more leisure, but the elite, despite losing a little bit of their ground on the common people, also made more money and used that surplus to invest in the arts and the sciences. So, ironically enough, not only did the Black Death and its horrors influence art heavily, But also, the surplus that was created from having fewer people to draw on resources meant that there was more money to spend on leisure, including intellectual pursuits. So the Black Death, it turns out, very much spurred Western intellectual development.